I'm Claude Akpabi, the education program specialist of the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean, based in Jamaica here. The focus of our session is on the Sustainable Development Goal 4, education, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And we are here to brainstorm and exchange on views on how best we can build on existing bodies of research and knowledge accumulated within the academia, and also taking into account the perspective of the civil society, private sector, in order to reinforce policymakers and practitioners' action to accelerate the achievement of the education goal for the Caribbean under the UN Multi-Sustainable Development Framework by 2020. And this stipulates that countries in the Caribbean have the imperative to increase access to quality education and lifelong learning for enhanced employability and decent and sustainable economic development. And this forms part of the priority area 1, namely an inclusive, equitable, prosperous Caribbean. To help us identify the major challenges and explore some of the recommendations on how we can accelerate such progress toward the SDG 4 in the Caribbean, we have distinguished panelists. 4 will be presenting, but we have 2 extra. I will be giving their name detail later on. And they will be giving us 4 presentations that will nicely complement one another, in the sense that they will provide us with good enough insight addressing the key fundamental issues faced by education, namely equality, relevance, and proper governance, building on the sharing of knowledge generated through research and good practices in the region. So we will have in the sequence Mr. Stephen Kerr from the PIOG, Jamaica, who will be presenting on creating high-quality schools in Jamaica, a situational analysis. We will have, following his presentation, Professor Sylvia presenting on behalf of 2 other of her colleagues. Professor Sylvia Kuenberg will be presenting on making SDG 4 real, contributing to relevant and effective learning outcome. Her 2 co-presenters are Dr. Michelle Kennedy and Dr. Yewande Lewis Fukum. I hope I get it right. The 3 of them are from the University of West Indies, Mona. Then we will have our friend Mr. Paul Murphy, who will be giving us a presentation on the effectiveness of development assistance in the education sector. The last presentation will be given to us by Mrs. Stacy Richards Kennedy from the Office of the Vice Chancellor of UE. And she will be giving us a presentation on the role of knowledge brokerage in advancing the 2030 development agenda in the Caribbean. And like I said, these 4 presentations are complementing each other very well. But we have for the session now, we were supposed to finish by 6. We have for the session in total 1 hour and a half now, so we have eaten up 1 hour. Each presentation, we expect it to last 15 minutes. We have a timekeeper who will be right in front of you, who will give you an indication of how much time is left for you to wrap up with your presentation. Our rapporteur is Ms. Mark Smith, who will be just here, will be taking note of the deliberation in the presentation and the deliberation during the discussion. So without further ado, I will invite Mr. Kerr to give his presentation. Thank you.
I am presenting on creating high quality schools in Jamaica, and I'm presenting to you a situation analysis. And so my objective is to provide a situation analysis of the education sector in Jamaica over the last 10 years, provide some general recommendation about how we improve the quality of our education system, and then make some specific recommendation relating to resource mobilization, strengthening civil society engagement, building evidence base for policy, and the capacity for public policy and rule of law institutions. My inspiration, I'm a trained teacher, I'm a father, I'm a researcher. I've been researching in education for the last 22 years. I work with the Planning Institute of Jamaica, so I've been a planner. And my concern has always been quality. And so these SDGs have arrived at the right time. My inspiration is from my son. And my son, I want you to understand that my inspiration in making this presentation is a strong belief that every child is our child. If you could get every stakeholder to understand that every child in front of you is our child. Just try and imagine if every principal, every teacher saw each child as their child, what a beautiful system we would have in Jamaica. And that's my mantra. How do we make every child our child? And so the background to my research, that all levels of the education system, from early childhood all the way to tertiary, there's a disparity in the quality of educational provisions. We actually think there's a dual system of education in Jamaica. There's a public perception that your life chance is dependent on which school you attend, from as early childhood to all the way to tertiary. Which school you attend determines where you go in the road of success. I'm also influenced by our NEI, National Education Inspectorate, recently completed a research on 900 schools, over 900 schools in Jamaica. And I leave with you, I start with the Chief Inspector's foreword in the report. The Chief Inspector noted that the system in Jamaica exhibits wide disparity in the quality as well as the effectiveness of schools. There's about half of our schools that are rated as being at least satisfactory. And as such, what is required is school improvement efforts, which have started but needs to be revved up in order to improve or to reduce the inequality of opportunities for many of our students in Jamaica. And so out of this Chief Inspector report, 953 schools were inspected, both at the primary and secondary level. 45% were inspected, were rated as effective. 55% were rated as ineffective. Among them, 86 secondary schools. Of the 162 secondary schools that were inspected, only one school made the grade as being exceptionally high. 32 good, 43 satisfactory, 79 unsatisfactory, and 7 in need of immediate support. Probably need to be shut down. But let's not bend on that right now. 77% of the schools in Jamaica were performing below MOEY established performance target. I did say I was a researcher. I'm currently doing some work in the School of Education at UWI on creating a model that will transform these 86 schools, a model that would say, in the space of 2 to 3 years, I am trying to create a model that will transform these 86 low-performing schools into high-performing schools. But we'll talk more about that. And so we have had an interest in terms of our situation analysis for years. Access was the means, was the launching ground of many political parties in Jamaica. Everybody wanted to create more schools. There was a time in Jamaica, there was an ad on TV that says, built by labor. And in this ad for 3 minutes, they named 50 schools that were built by labor. So we have had a concern, a desire to put more kids in school. So during the period, we've had many different initiatives, improving access as well as improving quality. Early as in the 2004, the Transformation Program, Vision 2030, the Ministry of Education has a strategic plan that goes up to 2020. We now have an Agenda 2030. And what we have seen over the period of time is an improvement in access. So if you look at our history between 1962 and last year, you will see improvement in access at every level of the system. And if you look even at tertiary level, we assume there are about 47 tertiary institutions in Jamaica. Back in 1962, there was only 11 across the whole country. So in terms of access, we have made some strides. But launched by Vision 2030, which aims to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business, there is a grounds for us creating quality schools because we are planning for a secure and prosperous future. So one of the goal one, is that Jamaica are empowered to achieve their fullest potential. There is a medium-term framework that says we're trying to develop and protect our human capital. The priority outcome from this Vision 2030, the education sector plan, is a world-class education and training system. The Ministry of Education National Education Strategic Plan speaks about high-quality educational product for all Jamaicans 3 to 18, which will equip them to become productive, contributing citizens. Agenda 2030, Goal 4, we spoke about it, Target 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.5, Target Goal 8, Target 8.6, all speak about improving the quality of life of people and improving the quality of life of all girls and boys in our system. So, if you look at some of our targets, and we have made strides in many of our targets in terms of literacy rates, we have improved over the period. If you look at our target back in 2007 as to where we are in 2016 and where we want to get to, we have made tremendous strides both in terms of literacy and numeracy. But I put to you that the quality of the system for half of our schools in Jamaica still lagging behind. I want to look at academic achievement as one example. The percentage of kids in our school who would meet the matriculation requirement for tertiary, back in 2010, only 25% of our students made that grade. Back in 2016, last year, 33% made that matriculation requirement. And so there is some improvement. But if you want to move this country ahead, a larger cohort of kids need to have that quality education. Looking again at the top 10 performing schools in Jamaica, the percentage of that cohort that had 5 subjects or more in the top performing schools in Jamaica, 96.5%. You took 50% of all the other schools, over 80 schools. The combined score of kids getting 5 subjects or more is less than 10%. Understand that in terms of understanding where you want to go in terms of quality. If you look at performance by sex, in every single exam that we have, girls outperform boys at everything that you can think of. At CSEC, if you look even at the quality of CSEC passes, you look at our grade 1s, our grade 2, our grade 3, you'll see that female outperform males in the quality of certification received. So these are some issues that we want to look at. In relating to accommodating children with disabilities, the WHO speaks about in every country there are 10 to 12% having some form of disability. And it agreed that in other countries it could go as high as 24%. So if we were to use the same scenario, calculating the number of kids in our schools between early childhood and secondary, it could be based on a limited estimation of 12% at 70,000 and 24% at 140,000. A recent child find by the Ministry of Education found over 10,000 students in poor performing schools that had some learning difficulties. And if there are poor performing schools, you are going to find a large proportion of students with learning difficulties. I'm also of the opinion that in many of our schools, our curriculum, our pedagogy, our teaching strategies don't cater for many of our kids. So they might be slow. If we could garner the methodology to get to some of these kids, what we would find is that they're very brilliant kids, just a change in methodology and a change in their learning styles. In terms of teacher quality, we have made some improvement. In 2016, over 89% of our teachers were trained. They were either trained graduates or trained teachers. Trained graduates, however, only 62.7% of our teachers were trained graduates, an improvement from 40%. But in order to make that transition, we would love to see 100% of our teachers being trained graduates. And that's where we think that quality will happen. At the early childhood level, I must say to you that maybe we are the only part of the place in the world where to qualify to train to teach at early childhood level, all they need is a basic proficiency in English and maths for many of these programs being offered in Jamaica. So only 30% of our teachers were trained at diploma level or above. 40%, 44% had vocational qualification, 13% had a bachelor's degree, and only 2% had a master's or a PhD level. Many of them were working as administrators, not as teachers. So we have some serious issues, especially at our early childhood level. We think if we can improve the quality of teachers, research has shown that effective teachers in 1 year can improve 53% percentage point growth in student achievement, while a least effective teacher gains are only 14%. So this is the status. 62% of our teachers are trained university graduates. We think that the pie should be bigger than that. In terms of resource allocation, we are probably the leaders in the world in terms of what percentage of our budget goes to education. If you check our budget, at least 15% of our budget goes to education, 15.7% last year. But the majority of this particular budget is for salaries and other emoluments. And when you look at the quality of teaching, those are some issues we need to look at. So we have made strides. We have support from IDPs, the private sector, Digicel, all these foundations are making contribution in terms of resource allocation. So there's potential. In terms of resource allocation, in our survey of living conditions, we have gone into the homes of people to query what are the issues with educational provisions in Jamaica. And transportation, textbook, access to textbook, and school feeding were some of the issues that came up on the radar, and these are some areas that we think that resource allocation need to be put in place, especially for kids in rural areas, primary and basic school kids, and the very poor in Jamaica. So in terms of recommendations, here are my 4 recommendations. In terms of school improvement, that's going to be key. Policy and school-based intervention to help student achievement, monitor performance, data-driven planning, target setting, gender-based instruction, improve accountability of our principals and teachers, and increase funding for under-resourced schools. My PhD research is about school turnaround model. Integral in turning around these 86 schools will be a model that works, that says, if you want to convert these schools, maybe we ought to look at moving the principal to Never Never Land. Maybe we ought to get teachers trained better on the job to help these students. Maybe we ought to understand that it can't be business as usual, it is business unusual. So these kids will need to come to school a little bit earlier, stay a little bit later, don't have summer holidays, but you ought to help them to help themselves. In terms of school effectiveness, everything shows leadership is going to be important. In the schools that I've looked at, there are some quality issues. I've done a research on an exploration as to what makes for quality schools. And what makes for quality schools is clear school mission, safe and orderly climate, transparent and effective monitoring of students' progress, high expectation. We expect high expectation from everybody, and parental involvement. We have found in some of our schools in our research that some of our schools have gone beyond their capacity. So they were built as small schools, but the population has doubled. Schools have taken on different things, sports, different sporting areas. Schools are running 50 acres of land. Schools have issues with violence and crime and behavioral management. So schools have taken on new dimensions for which the same people are being asked to handle all of those dimensions. I'm going faster. Marginalized groups, we think that we should leave, as it says, leaving no one behind. Our boys are at risk, and girls, but I am a boy, I have a son that's a boy. I want to ensure that there are policies in place to help this group move ahead of the game. The special needs group, policy and legislative reform. We have policies and legislation sitting on somebody's desk somewhere that has not made a transition into a law in Jamaica. We need a special education policy. We need to identify our kids. There are many of our kids in our system that needs to be identified early as when they leave the womb. Identified early what is wrong with this particular child and make them have the referrals to get them where they want to go. We need to promote inclusive education. There are many of our kids in our schools that need help. Capacity building, public education. Resource mobilization strategy, we need new and innovative ways. The IDPs, the diaspora, there's a saying that there are 2.7 million Jamaicans living outside of Jamaica. Many of them have an affiliation to a school here. How do we get them to contribute? And there are many who want to contribute. We need to strengthen civil society. We have groups already in place. We heard today about a National Oversight Committee that will look at the SDG. We have a program called QECs, Quality Education Circles. I think if this work, in every community there is a university. If you look even in this community that we're at, there's a university. There are 2 universities, there are high schools, there are primary schools. How can we collaborate to help the poor performing schools? Because we have high performing schools in the area. In terms of building the evidence base, we need to look at the importance of data. Everything that we will do to improve quality will be based on data. We need to look at results-based management. We need to look at strengthening our statistical system. We need to look at access to open source data. We need to sensitize the public. My last recommendation, we need to help those who need help to help us to get laws passed in Jamaica. We have an Education Act that has been sitting behind for years. How do we move that ahead? It's going to be key to improving the quality of education. I thank you for listening.
I'm presenting on behalf of an interdisciplinary team consisting of 2 linguists. I am the first name you see on the slide, Sylvia Cohenberg. The second one there is Michelle Kennedy. All right, so we're an interdisciplinary team. I'm Sylvia Cohenberg, linguist, Michelle Kennedy, also a linguist, and Joanna Lewis-Folcom, literacy education specialist. And we teamed up to design a course intended to enhance primary school teachers' ability to teach English language and literacy in a Creole-speaking context. And since all subject teaching and learning depends on English language competencies, we contend that by training primary school teachers in this fashion, that we will be able to contribute to relevant and effective learning outcomes across the primary school curriculum and not in language alone. We do this because poor educational outcomes are very well documented. In fact, my predecessor just spoke to some of these failures in the documentation of failures in the educational system. And we know, of course, that poor educational outcomes have serious implications for the ability of individuals to pursue their life goals and for our society to engage in and achieve inclusive socioeconomic development. As Dr. Luz Longsworth, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the UWI, put it this morning, we must be activists and interventionists to help achieve just, peaceful, and prosperous societies. And so the primary school project on which we report today is very much to be seen within that light as action research, so to speak. We began the initiative as a response to the Grade 4 Literacy Test results of 2014, which had then hardly improved from the previous year. The previous speaker elaborated quite a bit on some of the indicators of underperformance in the public schools, so I'm going to skip over some of the background issues. But let me say that when he referred to a dual education system, essentially the perspective that we bring to that as linguists is that quality education is a privilege reserved for English speakers, and that linguistic inequality translates into inequities in the educational system. Children from Creole-speaking communities enter English-speaking schools which are not prepared to meet their educational needs. Our course for primary school teachers is intended to address that. So my predecessor referred to the Chief Inspector of Education's report of 2015, these data from that same report. Interestingly, the report, the data that we see here on students' attainment in English at the primary level are primarily based on performance in language arts in the grade 6 achievement test. Now, 2 years before children write the grade 6 achievement test, they sit the grade 4 literacy test. And on the face of it, performance in the grade 4 literacy test far exceeds that on GSET language arts. However, despite pass rates that exceed 70% on the grade 4 literacy test, we have grave concerns. There is a performance gap between boys and girls of more than 10%, so a 70% overall pass rate translates into 60 for boys and 80 for girls, more or less. 45% of children sit the test in schools that perform below the national average. And most concerning of all, many students who pass the grade 4 literacy test are not actually reading at their grade level, if they are reading at all. So how is this even possible? So we have to understand that the Grateful Literacy Test is not a test of language competencies. It's a test that primarily tests basic alphabetic literacy. So it's possible to actually pass the test, but be unable to function in English, be it through speech, reading, or writing. And so the context for these poor English language learning outcomes is what we as linguists call the diglossic society. Diglossia is a term for a situation where two languages operate in a society and the two languages perform different functions. And what that means is that in order to function effectively in that context, you need to know both. So in the Jamaican context, that's Jamaican English and Jamaican Creole. So since Jamaican English is the language that is required for success in education, children who grow up as Creole speakers need to learn Jamaican English for educational attainment. So why don't they? Essentially, what happens in our classroom reflects what happens in the wider society. There is a strong and historically rooted belief that Jamaican Creole is not language, that it is merely a corrupted form of English, and that the way to learn English is to correct this poor use of the language. This belief has been able to persist because Jamaican Creole shares so much of its lexicon with Jamaican English. So on the face of it, the two languages are similar, and these similarities mask the fundamental differences in the grammars of the two languages. And I'd like to point you to the last point, the last bullet point on this slide, and that is that teaching language by way of correcting a child's error-free Jamaican Creole is psychologically damaging and pedagogically unsound. It is currently the only methodology at the disposal of teachers in the primary schools, since the entire curriculum is based on the assumption that children enter school speaking English. So what that means is that English is actually not taught in the primary schools. The upshot is that children's home language becomes an obstacle to English language learning when it should have been a stepping stone instead. And without proficiency in English, performance suffers across all content areas. The impact of this situation in the primary schools follows children into the secondary school, and if they're lucky enough to reach there, the tertiary level. And we just saw how few students in many of our public secondary schools actually qualify for tertiary level education. So what we see is that children from Creole-speaking backgrounds are systematically disadvantaged and marginalized. So this is actually a form of linguistic discrimination. All right, so we designed a course intended to empower primary school teachers to teach English language competencies to Creole-speaking children and break the cycle of marginalization. There are some linguistic insights that inform the course. One is that oral competencies must precede reading and written competencies in reading and writing. Another is that language teaching must include intentional teaching of grammar and patterns of use. Another is that in learning a language not your own, the learner must be directed to pay attention to that which is to be learned. And we propose that in order to be effective, we should aim for children to be enabled to communicate across English dialect and cultural boundaries globally. The course that we designed combines linguistic content with pedagogical content. And with the support of the Ministry of Education, we ran a pilot of this course with teachers from 8 schools across the Kingston area. Some schools have performed very poorly on the Grateful Literacy Test, some better and some quite well. As part of this pilot, we also visited teachers' classrooms and observed them, and we carried out an evaluation exercise. Here's an example of our treatment of the topic language in society in the course. In this social linguistic topic, we look at how societies are defined in terms of their language situations, at how individuals are defined by language, at how language is strongly associated with socioeconomic status, and how value judgments about the person who speaks the language operate in the society. And then, of course, we discuss the relevance of these insights, how they obtain in the Jamaican context, and how this gives rise to language attitudes which are present in the classroom as they are in the wider society, and how teaching practices may inadvertently help to perpetuate the negative values associated with speakers of one language as opposed to another. And we show how it is possible to teach language arts in a way that values both languages. Here's an example of a topic that is more formal in nature. I'm going to skip this since I'm running out of time a little. As part of this pilot, we also observed teachers in their own classrooms early in the course. And it is important to note that for many children, teachers provide almost a sole model for English language. Clearly, a single person cannot be a sufficient model for language learning, but there are very specific properties of language as it is used in the classrooms that make it even less suitable as a model for language learning. The course was intended to achieve the outcomes listed here, which include that we wanted to see intentional planned presentation of the different structures of the two languages, Jamaican Creole and Jamaican English, that we wanted to see teachers derive information from children's own speech for what needs to be taught, and that we wanted to see meaningful oral practice as well as reading practice and so on. So did we achieve this? Well, I can say that we achieved some. Prior to the course, this is a typical example of how a reading class was structured. Children engaged in reading practice with very limited understanding of the text that they were reading, were therefore unable to answer questions about it, and the emphasis on choral reading and repetition ensured that children were not able to engage with the text and that the needs of individual children were lost in the exercise. Here is an example of an effective lesson by a teacher who had adopted our models. Children were challenged to engage with elements of the text at different points in the reading, and the teacher told us that children who did not do so before were now actively participating in her reading classes. The class drew attention to vocabulary and ensured that the children came out with knowledge about language, and the class also valued Jamaican Creole in useful ways. Here is some of the feedback that we received from teachers' evaluation of the course, and it showed that their attitudes towards Creole and English had in fact changed. The last quote comes from a teacher in one of the schools where our reading pedagogies were embraced. "It works," is what she wrote. So this course is the outcome of an interdisciplinary collaboration, and we could not have developed it without the cross-fertilization between our different fields. But what the pilot showed us quite clearly were the limitations of the delivery model that we had adopted. We have redesigned the course, and we are preparing for a test run of the new delivery model, supported by a UE-MONA new initiative grant. And with this delivery model, we expect to be able to demonstrate impact not only on teachers' attitudes and classroom practice, but also on actual learning outcomes. And if you talk to us again about this time next year, we'll be able to give you those data. We come to recommendations. The Chief Inspector's report for 2015 points out that the quality of teaching is at the heart of effective schooling. In effect, the teacher remains the single most important resource in any classroom. The diglossic context where Creole and English operate in different domains of use crucially requires that Creole speakers are given a real chance at becoming bilingual. Competencies in English are needed for academic and other forms of success, and teachers therefore need to be comfortable with language pedagogies appropriate for the diglossic context and to have the knowledge base to deliver those pedagogies. Our recommendations speak to capacity building. We propose that in-service teachers with responsibilities for grades 1 to 4 in schools with at least 10 children in each grade be offered this training program. And we propose further that the insights of educational linguistics be used to inform a revision of the language arts curriculum in the teachers' colleges so that future teachers have the appropriate knowledge and are prepared to teach using pedagogies for the diglossic society. As Professor Sachs reminded us, there is no future development without investment. These are necessary investments in our primary education system. He also pointed out that quality education is the number one, number two, and number 3 determinant of our future success. We conclude by pointing out that this pedagogy allows teachers to recognize and use the comparative advantage that Jamaican Creole speakers have in learning English. And that is quite a change from the current situation in which Creole is treated as a hindrance to learning English. And so essentially, this pedagogy has the potential to change the face of education in the public primary schools. We see this as a model which can benefit other diagnostic societies in the region with similar inequities in the educational system. In sum, enactment of our recommendations is needed to ensure that English language and literacy teaching becomes relevant and effective so that children of Creole-speaking backgrounds have real opportunities to become bilingual, engaged citizens capable of participating in and benefiting fully from inclusive social and economic development. This is how our action research can become an agent of change for good. This is some of the people whose work has informed our own work, and that's the end of this presentation.
Basically now arriving at the conference this evening, about to make a presentation to you about the effectiveness of development assistance in the education sector. Now I hope the timekeeper would have given me a few additional seconds for my Jamaican story. Ladies and gentlemen, I should warn you that unlike many of the presenters that you would have heard earlier today, and you will hear over the next couple of days, this is research in action, the results and findings of which are not expected to be known before the end of the year. However, before I get into the heart of my presentation, let me begin by identifying the several topics that have been selected as part of this academic journey. The presentation begins with some general background information, an exploration of the issues relative to the funding of education, the Caribbean perspective on official development assistance, and ends with the penultimate topics end with a focus on a number of the preliminary findings and some concluding thoughts on where I expect the research to lead us. Now, since 2015, the global community has moved away from the 8 goals and 22 targets of the Millennium Development Goals and is now pursuing an ambitious agenda for sustainable development with 17 goals and over 150 targets covering such areas as poverty reduction, reduced inequalities, climate change and resilience, and decent work and economic growth. However, if I asked you, which sector immediately comes to mind when you think of the sustainable goals and the 2030 agenda, what would your answer be? Education certainly is the first on my mind and at the top of my agenda. Public education is arguably the biggest developmental initiative undertaken by many governments, very often outweighing or outperforming the emphasis placed on healthcare and other social services. Statistical evidence supporting this position has been provided by several academics who established that in most societies, governments assume the principal responsibility for providing citizens with the opportunity to become educated and receive the benefits of increased income, healthier lifestyles, and life expectancy. Given this fact, it is noteworthy that according to the UNESCO Education for All Monetary Report of 2014, although spending on education has increased by around $3 billion annually in low-income countries, it still only amounted to half the public spending required to achieve basic education for all. Notwithstanding the arguments in support of public education, in support of public financing for education, these arguments do not imply that governments alone should finance all education in a country. Indeed, in many countries, the education system includes privately provided or privately financed institutions and programs. The private funding of education, therefore, occupies an increasingly evolving space in the funding of education debate. In fact, research by the World Bank, UNESCO, and other development institutions show that private sources of financing education represent about 20% of total national education financing. And I'll skip to multilateral financing. Limitations of the public, private, and bilateral network has allowed multilateral donor organizations to play an increasingly significant role in the development of education sectors across the developing community, the developing world. The 5 largest MDOs, the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Development Bank for Construction and Development, have contributed approximately 20% of the total aid to education over the past decade, thus becoming a significant source of financing and technical assistance to many developing countries. However, in spite of the prioritization of education by multilateral development agencies, according to publications by UNESCO, only about 2% of the total educational expenditure by developing countries is financed through international sources. As it relates to the Caribbean, the literature reveals that since the 1980s, the region has been able to secure a steady flow of external assistance. Net flows to the Caribbean region increased from an average of US $1.2 billion in the 1980s to $2.2 billion in the 1990s and has exceeded $4.4 billion in the 2000s. However, when measured as a percentage of gross national income, development assistance now represents only 0.18% of the region's GNI, a significant decline of the 0.4 of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In addition to the precipitous decline in official development assistance, another worrying trend is the allocation methodology associated with donor aid in the region. The criteria disregard the heterogeneity or internal structural gaps faced by countries in the Caribbean. Another feature of the official development assistance impact on the Caribbean, as noted by the World Bank, is that multiple aid channels impose an additional strain on already weak implementation capacities in these developing countries. Certainly progress has been made in attempting to understand the impact of donor aid on education-specific indicators. However, given the mix of results, more research needs to be conducted to deepen our understanding. This is especially relevant within the Caribbean, given its reliance on aid to implement transformative policies in the education sector. Therefore, the problem to be addressed by my study involves determining how the institutional processes of the various multilateral agencies operating in the Caribbean space may have affected the funding models utilized in the development of education. In order to fully explore this topic, the following research questions will be investigated. What are the factors affecting the access to and implementation of donor-funded education projects in the Caribbean, specifically in Jamaica and Guyana? To provide further clarity within the context of the study, the following sub-questions will also be explored. Firstly, how does the relationship between the donor agencies and Caribbean countries evolve into the development of education projects? Secondly, what are the conditions of the financing agreements governing development aid for education projects in the Caribbean? And how do these affect implementation progress and project outcomes? And finally, how does this process compare and contrast in Guyana and Jamaica across the 3 donor agencies? The interest in finding investment models that break the cycles of inefficiency and lead to improved quality outcomes in education has occupied the attention of governments of the Caribbean for several decades, but particularly so in recent years. In this regard, the purpose of this study will be to determine the institutional constraints and processes inhibiting multilateral development institutions in the region from effectively addressing the delivery of quality education through the projects and programs they finance. Specifically, the study will examine the distance between the goals and objectives identified during policy development and the results and outcomes at completion of 6 education-funded projects specifically. I've run out of time, and I'm going to skip immediately to what I consider to be some preliminary findings. While it's early days yet with respect to the collection of data, a broad stroke analysis of the documentation interrogated thus far has revealed the following. In every instance, the date of eligibility of first disbursement of our loans was delayed. Implementation progress was usually unsatisfactory, and in general, the proposed implementation appeared to be overly optimistic. With respect to project design, there was an incompatibility between the implementation schedule and institutional capacity and the complexity of the project design. And with respect to project completion, invariably, implementation and disbursement periods had to be revised. In conclusion, notwithstanding the positive results, especially in terms of expanding access, as my colleagues have mentioned earlier, to primary and secondary education in the region, there's an acknowledgement that more needs to be done to strengthen the completion of education and extend its links to the workforce. In this regard, the role of development assistance in the region cannot be overemphasized. Thus, both borrowing member countries and multilateral development organizations must be willing to point development assistance towards a results orientation, enhanced development effectiveness, and greater ownership by beneficiaries and key stakeholders in recipient countries. It is hoped that my research will assist in this effort. Again, as I said, I'm now about to start the interrogation of the documents, so no definitive findings or recommendations to share at this point. I thank you.
The title of my presentation is The Role of Knowledge Brokerage in Advancing the 2030 Development Agenda. It's based on a paper prepared for this conference, co-authored by my colleague Lois and Bryce of the Office of Research Development and Knowledge Transfer, with research assistance from Ms. Miriam Self of the Office of Development. This presentation is structured as follows. I'll begin by speaking about the context in which the paper is situated, advancing the SDGs in the Caribbean. Then I will focus more specifically on knowledge brokerage, what it is, how it works, and based on a review of the literature, and then take a look at a specific case, an RTI Fund project that has used knowledge brokerage strategies and what were the ultimate results coming out of that. Then I will offer some recommendations for more effective knowledge brokerage in the Caribbean, and close by reiterating the importance of knowledge brokerage to the achievement of the SDGs. As we all know, the Sustainable Development Goals approved in 2015 represent an ambitious agenda to address economic prosperity and environmental sustainability by 2030. This will require the focused efforts of developed and developing countries alike, but it will also require strong partnerships across the full spectrum of development partners: public, private, civil society, multilateral development agencies, and so on. And whereas in the past, universities were traditionally perceived as being set apart or more detached from society, the integrated nature of the 2030 development agenda will mean not only a reconfiguration of relations among key stakeholders, but also a re-examination of the role of the university itself as we seek to achieve the SDGs. And some of this was highlighted in this morning's opening ceremony with mention of the increased activist role of universities. Research and knowledge are at the core of the SDG agenda. Localization will require the identification and prioritization of development issues, the compilation and analysis of disaggregated data, and specialist expertise to devise relevant and context-appropriate solutions. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, in an address he gave in 2016 at the University College in Dublin, emphasize that the complexity of the SDGs calls upon universities to lead, and I will add to lead boldly. So this paper argues that as Caribbean countries examine strategies for accelerating SDG implementation, linkages between the university, government, industry, and development partners will need to be strengthened, and systematic mechanisms put in place to facilitate the two-way flow of information, the co-creation of knowledge, and the application of research to solve the region's development challenges. So knowledge brokerage and research translation can help to reduce the research to policy and gaps, as well as the research to practice gaps, which the literature has shown affect the achievement of development outcomes. As we know, Caribbean countries have experienced moderate to low economic growth for several decades. The Caribbean has lagged behind other developing countries in East Asia and Africa in every decade since the 1970s, with growth rates even lower than those in the least developed countries. A cross-section of the Human Development Indices for the Caribbean also reflects a very worrying picture, with poverty rates in some territories as high as 37%, unemployment rates as high as 24%, youth unemployment rates as high as 33%. And this is for countries that have been classified as middle income or high middle income countries. So closing these gaps to achieve the SDGs in just over a decade will require radical shifts. Several frameworks have already been put in place, the SDGs at the global level, the 4 pillars of the MSDF at the regional level, the CARICOM strategic plan, and the multiple national development plans across our Caribbean territories. So Caribbean countries have a clear sense of what needs to be done. What is not clear is how. How do we go about mobilizing diverse stakeholders to implement in a coordinated fashion targeted action plans to solve complex multidisciplinary development challenges? How will we build links between disparate agendas and sectoral action plans so that we can optimize the use of scarce resources? How will we pool collective expertise and experiences to agree on priority actions to achieve the SDGs? And what is the role of the university in this process? The authors of the paper see knowledge brokerage as central to this undertaking. Some useful definitions have been included on this slide, and we're looking more specifically here at what does knowledge brokerage entail. Knowledge brokerage is all the activity that links decision makers with researchers, facilitating their interaction so that they are better able to understand each other's goals and professional cultures, influence each other's work, forge new partnerships, and promote the use of research-based evidence in decision-making. It is about bridging the gap between knowledge producers and knowledge users. And a vital aspect is the facilitation of the social interaction through relationship and network development in order to share and utilize knowledge. It requires strategies to connect people to the knowledge they need. When one considers the many processes involved in knowledge transfer, it highlights the need for mediating roles for these processes to occur. So why knowledge brokerage? Here we have an interesting schematic that highlights the recursive nature of knowledge brokerage and the multi-directional interactions for enhancing research to policy by focusing on exploiting knowledge, distilling knowledge, reframing policy problems, redirecting and redefining information feedback, challenging dominant individual mental models, and facilitating the generation of research questions. So what does knowledge brokerage entail? Well, there are several frameworks that have been mentioned in the literature, but there are three main models of knowledge brokerage that are recognized today: the knowledge management model, the linkage and exchange model, and the capacity building model. And let me point out here that the practice of knowledge brokerage, we have found that there's a blurring and mingling among the three models as many interventions combine elements from the different models. Some limitations to knowledge brokerage, I'll point out, include the lack of evidence from rigorous evaluation to support the effectiveness or to rather illuminate exactly how it works and the contextual factors that influence it. Difficulty in evaluating knowledge brokerage is due to the complexity of the activity and to the multiplicity of brokering models used. Also, it's challenging because of the significant amount of time and resources required to render brokerage strategies successful. So we recognize that in the Caribbean and in our own University of the West Indies, there are several researchers who are using knowledge brokerage strategies, but what I think the major challenge that we see is that it's not done in a sustained way. It tends to be done in an ad hoc way, and it's not, because it's not sustained, it does not allow for the full potential to be maximized. There's no specific or explicit focus on knowledge brokerage as part of research projects and in the wider research process. There are few mechanisms in place to track the progress and the impact of the knowledge mobilization activities. So this paper seeks to demonstrate the value of a systematic approach to knowledge brokerage and the myriad benefits that we would have observed from tracking the progress of the RDI projects. So the RDI Fund, very quickly, is a research and development impact fund that exists at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus in Trinidad, and it was established in 2012. The focus is to strengthen third stream activities by providing dedicated funding for projects that address the most pressing development issues. It's an incentive for researchers to plan for impact in the design and implementation of their research projects. There are 6 thematic areas linked to the national development priorities, and the case study that I'll focus on is one that project entitled Leveraging the International Cocoa Gene Bank that was executed by the Cocoa Research Center at the St. Augustine campus. So very quickly, the primary objective of this project was to improve the productivity and quality of cocoa through the development of genetic markers and agronomic strategies to improve competitiveness of the cocoa industry. So what did they do? How did the CRC project use knowledge brokerage? They embraced several strategies borrowing from all 3 models, and they focused on dissemination and translation using ICT and social media across a range of different platforms. For research translation, they produced diverse knowledge products and made sure these were disseminated to different audiences. To help cultivate research demand, they kept close to the policy and practice issues and helped to convert them into research questions that were developed in collaboration with strategic partners. They used also linkage and exchange strategies to develop more research partnerships and collaborations with local, regional, and international partners. They created new networks, such as Partnership and Conservation Network. They were able to generate new funding through these networks and partnerships to the tune of the equivalent of US $4 million. So this is something that we were able to observe by tracking the knowledge brokerage strategies over time and to really connect what were the outcomes and impacts of the different projects and how these were benefiting the Cocoa Research Center. So I'm going to go through quickly. We have here a slide that outlines an infographic that highlights the results and impacts and pulls it together, where we see a graph that highlights the additional funding attracted, what they were able to achieve in terms of capacity building, dissemination of different types of knowledge products, including journal articles, book chapters, conference presentations, and student theses that have been completed, and some are even ongoing. And then the wide range of research collaborations that they were able to pursue coming out of by leveraging the RDI project. So on to recommendations very quickly. Accelerating the SDGs in the Caribbean will require greater focus and attention on knowledge brokerage as a part of the university's core business, not an add-on to teaching and research. Given the challenges faced by the region in stimulating economic and social growth, this is a more pressing need to revisit a more appropriate model, an effective model for the university in the Caribbean, one that blends the entrepreneurial with the developmental. And UWI's new strategic plan, with its 3 pillars, access, alignment, and agility, will places significant emphasis on rekindling the activist spirit of the university that we see as absolutely essential to support the revitalization of Caribbean development. I'll just wrap up because I know time is, we are short on time. I will conclude by returning to my initial points on why knowledge brokerage is a critical, although perhaps an unrecognized component of the roadmap to SDG achievement in the Caribbean. We believe this is important because of the need to strengthen the means of implementation under SDG 17, which calls for countries to look at strengthening and revitalizing global partnerships for sustainable development. The other main point has to do with SDG acceleration, and this entails targeting resources to priority areas by paying specific attention to synergies and trade-offs. And so there are 3 main components for SDG acceleration, which have to do with use of disaggregated data, fostering integration and synergy, and achieving risk-informed development by mapping individual and community vulnerabilities and risks. A deliberate and systematic approach to knowledge brokerage is therefore essential to achieve both the sharing of knowledge and the strengthening of multi-stakeholder partnerships under means of implementation, and the evidence-informed targeting needed for SDG acceleration in the Caribbean. I thank you.
You can go ahead, please.
Ununo, Pignidam, Chat Patwa. This is really important as an American in the Peace Corps, as a volunteer. In Jamaica, we spend 3 months with doing integration, and a big part of that is learning Patwa and being able to hear that. And you know, the whole spectrum of it, from basically just Jamaican English with a few words down to the Baselect, which is its own thing, and as you all know. And it's critical to remember that, because then we suddenly, after that 3 months, are moved into Jamaican schools. And it's a shock to us to realize some of the very Eurocentric elements in those Jamaican schools. And I'm sorry I have to put it that way. Because it's like trying to teach a Jamaican kid how to read phonetically when they don't speak that at all. During that, and when you speak English at home, is a challenge enough. So if you, there's a very robust Cassidy alphabet for Patois and for similar forms around the Caribbean. So that could easily be done. It can easily be compared. And it plays into, also how there are Eurocentric ideals of beauty regarding especially hair and skin bleaching that we sort of normalized. And then also to prioritizing simply what tourists consider to be beautiful in Jamaica while neglecting your own communities and our own communities. As volunteers, we're embedded here. So, to be able to talk in Patois and to say that this is something that kids are proud of, I think is a huge step. And just to consider that whenever you have the chance to, and whenever someone says it's just impractical, or it's just one more hoop to jump through. Thank you.
Yes, there are fairly straightforward ways in which we can change the pedagogy to go from what children already know, because they already know a language, and the language is Jamaican Creole, to take them from what they already know to what they need to know, which is, for instance, the sound system of English, and how spelling provides an indication not only of how spelling can provide information about how words sound differently in English from the way they are actually articulated in Patois, for instance. Thank you.
Carolyn Hale, University of the West Indies. I'd like to make some comments. Stephen first. Specifically about I chair Papine High School, and they claim that the school was a failing school, but we have done satisfactory in all of the areas except one, which was the teaching and learning. And I'm glad for that, because we can now identify exactly which teacher is causing the problem. I don't have any problem with that. What I do have a problem with is that they keep, when you refer to the CSEC, they refer to just the year that whatever year they're doing the research in. They say the children didn't pass more than 5 subjects in that year. And I keep saying to them, in some of the schools, you need to look at the student. How many subjects does that student have leaving the school? Because in our case, the children may take CSEC from 3rd form. So they have in 3rd, they have in 4th, and they have in 5th. In fact, at prize giving this year, one young man I think he got 8 subjects, and we had him on the program for 8. And he came and said, look, I am not satisfied. I have 11 subjects, and you're putting me here as 8. What about the others that I got? So we have to look at the student passes and not the year. The schools like to say year because it makes them feel grand. But the children are actually doing quite well. And to speak to the patois, we actually teach them in patois. I mean, we use the patois because if you come to prize giving, we speak in 3 languages. We welcome the parents in English. We welcome you in English, Spanish, and patois. So they use it in the system. Come to another issue, perception. We're very opinionated people. And so we perceive all kinds of things which are not necessarily so. And it comes to the knowledge broker issue. I agree with you that it's a good start. And I'm speaking from practical experience. And Stephen, you know about the workforce colleges that I put in when I was at Heart Trust. We had a model that we had put in where we had brought the universities, we had brought what I call the street genius, and use the heart facilities with the tech back facilities for people to create new products. As soon as governments change, they take it out because it doesn't fit with what they want. But then it was in the IMF documents. The IMF said, put it back. So they put it back, but the structure that supported that was gutted, so you can't get the effect. These are some of the real issues that we deal with. I give you another simple example. I'm not hugging it up, but these are concrete things, and we have to address it if you're talking about sustainable development. Ramji Singh, he's dead now, one of our good statisticians here. He did a piece of research on the factors that determine hotel occupancies. And it was determined that it was events. Events drive heads to beds. So there was a whole event strategy built out. As soon as government changed, we can't use the word event, so we go to entertainment. But the empirical evidence tells you that it's events. We have got to get people to understand that researchers don't necessarily tell you what you want, you know. We give you facts, and we will help you shape the facts. And if you know your area of expertise, you can use the information we have given you to create whatever product you want. But you cannot change facts. These are some serious issues that have to be addressed.
I agree with you. Recently, I was trying to get some data out of Barbados and had similar challenges. Barbados was able to say that in 1 year, only 10% of their students get 5 subjects or more. And I couldn't understand why it would only be 10%, when in fact there is a policy in many high schools in Barbados and in Jamaica to have an entire cohort of kids doing English, doing maths. So by the time they get to 5th form, it would seem as if they don't have enough subject. But I want to tell you that apart from that particular issue, there are other issues in relating to the quality of our schooling that we need to look at. And that's going to be very important in moving these SDGs around. As it relates to your question relating to the Jamaica Standard English, that we have the opinion that in moving schools to quality schools, we might have to teach English as a second language. So you go into a lab, just like you're learning a foreign language, and consider that this language is a foreign language to many of our students. And we think that might be one of the things that would move us into quality schools.
I like the example you gave of the trilingual greetings or speeches, because one of the things that we want to see more of is that Jamaican Creole is given value in, let's say, non-traditional contexts, so that both children and teachers, by the way, can feel that it's okay to use Jamaican Creole. One of the things that we found is that teachers often felt that if they explained something in Creole, it was no longer formal instruction. And, as far as we were concerned, if you explain something as a teacher, it is formal instruction. If it is more effective in Creole than it is in English, then okay. But then at the same time, it needs to also be the basis for moving forward with the English language explanation. Okay, so thank you for that example.
I just wanted to touch on the 5C subject issue that you raised in relation to Jamaica. And that's very interesting, and it goes back to what I was discussing earlier about how do we link what the multilateral development community does with respect to its borrowing member countries. And in fact, IDB, CDB, the World Bank, that's one of our very specific indicators. How many CSEC, well, at least passing 5 CSEC subjects, including math and English, in any given year. And therefore, I wonder if we are not the ones perpetuating this problem in the region by requesting and demanding that this be something that is placed as an outcome indicator in our results monitoring frameworks when we come to do projects and initiatives with our borrowing member countries.
Thank you. Two comments regarding the point on the changing of the policies with changes in the elections. I think it touches on what Paul spoke about, which is development effectiveness and the need for our decision makers to really commit to long-term development planning. It's not just the rhetoric of it, it's really to ensure that we stay the course. Once we have policies and programs in place that work, and we need to continue to support them and to implement them and to ensure that we extend the coverage or widen the scope so that others can benefit from them. And then the other point about persons rejecting the evidence or rejecting the data, I think speaks to another issue that we're seeing across the region, which is the need to cultivate research demand and an appreciation for evidence and data, which is, in a dispassionate way. So that appreciation can then translate into greater evidence-based policy making. And not, so it's data-driven decision-making, but not the opposite, not decision-driven data-making, which is what we tend to see in the region. We need to make sure that there's that allegiance to the ethics and the integrity of evidence-based policymaking.
Thanks to the panel for the presentations. My question is to Mrs. Richards-Kennedy. From your paper, what are some of the implications for funding research projects and strengthening their knowledge brokerage activities?
Okay, that's an excellent question because the paper touches on three aspects. It touches a bit on development effectiveness, it touches on research impact, and it touches on policy and program evaluation, because knowledge brokerage is central to all three domains or schools of thought. And when it comes to the issue of donor funding and the implications for donor funding, what we see emerging from the projects that we've reviewed is the fact that we need to rethink the approach to funding research projects, because typically you have a grant given to a researcher, and within that specific time frame, 2 to 3 years, for the project execution, they will have a specific budget allocation for knowledge mobilization, knowledge transfer, communication, and dissemination. However, when you look at the research impact side of the project, the impacts don't happen until the project has ended. And so there's a time lag, and this is well documented in the research. There's a time lag between project research, execution, and the evidence, the emergence of the impact. And when the funding runs out at the end of the project, that's exactly the point when the researchers will need, after a year or so, that's when they start seeing the impacts, and you now need the funding to disseminate and to mobilize and to share and to go out there in communities and to share your research and to then have the co-creation of knowledge. So for example, Sylvie's project that she mentioned, receiving a specific grant from the Mona campus, the new initiative grant. Now is the time when the project has been completed and you're distilling the information, the findings, and gathering all of the results, the feedback. What I would recommend is that the donor agencies and the funders consider a second-tier funding. Second-tier funding or second-phase funding for research projects that have demonstrated a certain potential for societal impact. And that second-tier funding would kick in a couple years after the project has been completed, because that's precisely when you have valuable information, key insights and lessons that you can now go out and share with all the stakeholders.
Hi, thank you. I also recommend that they should have a second round for funding as well too. Too many times the information is not shared or it's not picked up by persons who are researching something in that field that are passionate, trying to make an impact, I myself included. And sometimes you catch it and sometimes you don't. And the gap in between that can be years and years and years separated. So if we're trying to have 20, 30 goals here, that is a major, 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 major issue. I just want to say one more thing as well too. Mr. Carr was talking about possibly whether there needed to be, no summer breaks and teaching going on the weekends. I was taught in Jamaica and was fortunate to be an exchange student and went to Denmark and lived there for a year and returned sometime after. I tell you, lessons were no longer than 3 hours. There was no homework. And one of the things that I noticed most of all was that adults spoke to children like they were adults. And out here, we speak down to everybody. We seem to demand this arrogant attention and respect, which is actually the opposite of it. It is disrespectful. And that does not engage children in a conversation where they can speak and say things which are smart. There's no such, there's no stupid question out there, They should be confident to say and express how they feel. And the reason I'm also mentioning this is that with all of these sustainable development goals, which I'm actually teaching with a pilot project in downtown Kingston and in Portmore, which I've gotten grant funding from the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica. To find the time from these teachers to schedule something, to train the trainers before we move on to empowering the teachers, building school farms, and measuring the impact of what it is that we're doing. It is very, very difficult to be able to tie these teachers down. They want to know what's in it for them. All right? And the students also want to know what's in it for them. And the fact of the matter is that we have great stuff, which is that they can use right here and now, as opposed to a lot of things that we're taught in the education system you use later on when you're an adult and you pick up a certain profession. So I don't think more stress on these teachers is a solution. They already seem to be carrying kind of water in a basket. Thank you.
I want to respond. I'm doing some work on creating quality schools in Jamaica, and your point is excellent. We have found that in order to transform schools, we're going to have to get into the minds of students, and to the minds of teachers, and to the minds of principals. And one of the things that we found, and you're right, there's a culture in Jamaica that kids should be seen and not heard. And how we get past that particular culture is part of how we're going to get to quality schools. And so, what we do, it's understanding that business as usual is sending out kids that are not prepared for life. And what I've seen in other systems is an arrangement between parent and school, that for kids who are not doing well, they might need to come to summer school. That summer school is going to be an important part of getting them ready for that standard that they need to get by the next grade. So this is a site at Excelsior High School. This is a collaboration between parent, the school, that my child needs to get to somewhere by September. And in so doing, this child will have to come to summer school. I'm just giving that as an example. What I'm also showing is that in the research that I have done, in quality schools, the teachers have a love for teaching. And this love goes beyond watching the clock. And so that criteria of getting into quality schools is going to have to do some psychometric testing of getting teachers who really love teaching. They don't watch clock. They don't watch time. These are the teachers who understand that, as I said in my research, every child is your child. And so they understand that this child is not making the grade. He needs to come half an hour early. We need to stay with him half an hour later because I love this thing called teaching. That's one of the ingredients that we need in order to make that transition.
I would like to respond to that because I've been working with some what we might call underperforming primary schools, and I see a lot of teachers who love teaching, and yet they're not able to achieve much success because they don't have the right tools for it. But also there is so much emphasis on standardized testing that they really don't get around to real teaching and learning. And one of my concerns is that children aged 3 and 4 are supposed to be taught literacy, when in fact they should be taught what we might call literacy readiness. And there is really no need for literacy to be taught until children are about 6 years of age and enter primary school. And so all the skills that children are supposed to have before they enter school, motor skills, spatial skills, other kinds of cognitive skills, are completely lacking. Okay, so it's I feel bad for teachers when I hear that, oh, if only you were a quality teacher, you would do better, you would stay longer in school, you would get better results. I think that's absolutely untrue, and it is really unfair to the teachers who are working very, very hard for little reward, very often under difficult circumstances. All right, this thing about children are supposed to be seen, not heard. You go into these schools, there's huge amounts of noise in the schools. Children are making a lot of noise. However, it is noise without purpose. It is noise because they can't be controlled. Exactly, they cannot be controlled. And this is part of the reason that having children sit in school from 8:30 to whatever time, 3 o'clock, it's not working. It's not working. Okay, thank you. The solution would be, first of all, at the basic level, the pre-primary level, is to focus on the literacy and numeracy readiness skills. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that children have to be engaged through play, because that is the age at which they are supposed to be engaged through play. And when I showed you the example of an effective reading lesson, I think that engagement that the children had in that reading lesson with elements in the text, that's the kind of engagement that keeps their brains going. And they were challenged to think about the text in different ways. They were challenged to think about words. They were challenged to think about characters. They were challenged to think about storyline. They were challenged to think about how the English text actually compared to their own Jamaican Creole expressions as well. And so their own language was also made into a resource in engaging with that text. And it excited them. It was pretty clear.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garth Gibson, and I'm part of the Jamaican diaspora that's back here to listen and to learn about what can be done to help Jamaica as we go through some of these changes. And now, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for the interesting presentations that were made. But what I'd like to hear is how you connect, because we're here talking about sustainable development, how you connect your wonderful ideas with sustainability. For me, it might be a simple question, a question to answer, but I'd like to hear a little bit more.
The issue of sustainability has to do with quality. And we understand that there are a high percentage of our schools in Jamaica that are not centers of excellence. And as far as I'm concerned, in order to make that transition, we have to create quality schools. There are people who are lining up to transfer to better quality schools in Jamaica. So in order to relate to sustainability, there's going to be a need to create quality schools right across Jamaica. And so in terms of resources, I could see where, much of the work that I've done so far suggests an active role for the diaspora. Not only in just, much of the work has to do with teachers, teacher quality. You look at any research, it will tell you that teacher quality and leadership quality are two of the most important ingredients to creating quality schools. If you could improve the quality of leadership in our school, that's one of the sustainable efforts that we could do to create quality schools in Jamaica, to ensure that we have quality leaders and we have quality teachers.
Okay, so as an example, the recommendations that we made are about the training of in-service teachers, but also about changes in the curriculum in the teachers' colleges. And it is the changes in those curricula that will make what we are trying to do sustainable, because then it becomes part of the long-term perspective.
In response to your question, I sat here and I listened to your presentation. I, of course, listened to your presentation and was quite impressed by it. And I'm thinking, as an officer of the Caribbean Development Bank, we often go into our foreign member countries and we say, oh, you have some serious psychosocial issues happening within your schools, and we need to engage a consultant to come in and do some work with the Ministry of Education to bring some relief to whatever situation that we may find. I'm not sure that as an organization we actually tap into some of the research and activities on the ground, and therefore there's already ownership for these activities, and that speaks to sustainability in my view. How much more can we as an organization use your research, your project, and sort of institutionalize it across Jamaica or across other foreign member countries of the region? Your area of study as well, what you're doing with the youth in various communities in Jamaica. How often do we as an organization go in and say, this is a product of Jamaica, they're proud of it, it's working, let us support it, let us ensure that it is spread more generally across the education sector. I don't think we do that often enough. I think more often than not, we kind of impose our thinking, our thoughts, our programs and our projects on our countries rather than utilizing what they have already to offer.
Good afternoon again. I just have one comment. It's obviously welcome for feedback, or it's just food for thought. In keeping with the message that has been reiterated several times this morning, no one left behind, and now we're speaking about quality education. Just based on my experience with the Caribbean schooling system, we have a very aggregated approach to how we look at students, and we look at them as a class and not necessarily as individuals who learn differently. And I'm not sure that we are taking every student with us on this development path. Are we prepared to, or how are we training our teachers to deal with kids who learn differently or who may have special needs? Because we have a tendency, because we're so focused on these testing, that kids who are slower generally get left behind, because you put all the emphasis on the kids that are performing. But of course, that's another broad statement, because I don't know how the individual schools are functioning. It's just based on my experience with the Caribbean schooling system. So I think that's something that we need to consider if we're really going to live by this no one left behind principle.
Yeah, I can respond to that, because there are programs to train special needs teachers. However, the problem is that schools are not able to appoint teachers beyond a particular teacher-to-student ratio. And so they do sometimes hire special needs teachers, but they very often end up using them as form teachers and not really as special needs teachers. So there's this need for schools to be able to actually use a special needs teacher as a special needs teacher who can take children out of the classes and use them. Yeah.
I know they keep saying this, and I was just wondering for the record what that ratio is at the moment. And also, it has always occurred to me that we spend a lot of time worrying about the ratio of our dollar to the US dollar. Surely we should be paying way more attention to the ratio of our students to our teachers, and we should be striving to make sure that we have as many teachers to students as we possibly can. And isn't that figure very important with regard to quality?
There's a search that shows, and when I went to primary school, there are 50 of us in the class. were 50 of us to one great teacher. And in that class, because of the perception of that particular school, everybody wanted to send their kids to that school. And so this teacher, over a period of time, had created this ability to ensure that everybody passed. Much of it was after school, however. But the idea is that she was able to get all 50 to pass this particular test. So the issue of quality, the issue of school size matters, but in some scenario it doesn't. I'm not trying to get to that point. But what we do have, we have a scenario in Jamaica of, at the primary level, there are approximately 29 students to every teacher, an average for the country. But there are schools or classes across Jamaica in which we have 50 and 55. But for the most part, in those scenarios, it's a better quality teacher in that scenario. The essence behind creating quality schools is about small sizes. The school that I did some research at had a policy. The average class size should be 12 to 15. They can afford that because the people pay a lot of money to get into these schools. But the average size as it relates to different, for example, special ed, standard is under 10. And so how could we afford across Jamaica the ability to have one special ed for every 10 students that has a special needs in Jamaica? Is something that we're grappling right now. And in my estimation, might be wrong, one of the reasons why we don't have a special ed policy in Jamaica right now. But issue is to be considered.
A couple of comments in terms of the quality of the teachers, and they have to have a love for teaching. I mean, you have to have a passion for something in this world if you're going to be successful at it. And going back to testing and having a good teacher that was at the school that you went to, that everybody wanted to go to, passing, all 50 students passing doesn't mean all 50 students were thriving. I passed, but school did not relate to me in the way that it was taught to me until I experienced different ways in which education was taught. In terms of the sustainability goals and what's the connection, is that I'm not quite sure what the plan is in schools. I have been working on using my own sustainability, well, borrowing sustainability goals from the United Nations and many other established curriculum out there, which I'd be happy to share with others to come up with a plan to get this into school, which is my goal. But a big word which is constantly being used is sustainability, right? And the definition of sustainability is enough. And so therefore, sustainability goals in teachers and making the connection can't be quality, it has to be diversity, because diversity is what is going to bring abundance. I'm not sure if everybody would quite understand what I mean by that diversity, but the more we understand nature and the more that the physicists go out there and try to discover better ways of engineering, better ways of the way the universe was discovered, etc., all comes back down to figuring out what were the natural forms and how it's created. And it's always nature has a diverse way of using the least amount of materials to produce the maximum amount of energy.